Every morning, someone reaches into a bag, pulls out a slice of bread already cut to a uniform half-inch thickness, and drops it into a toaster without a second thought. It is such an unremarkable action that language itself absorbed it. When people want to praise something, they still say it is the best thing. Since sliced bread, almost no one asks what that actually means, or why a piece of cut wheat became the benchmark for human progress. The answer is not really about bread. It is about what happens when a single mechanical fix collides with an economy already straining to change. The common assumption is that sliced bread must be an old idea, something that arrived quietly alongside the rest of industrial food production, sometime in the vague 19th century. It feels too simple, too obvious, to have a specific birthday. In reality, bread had existed in something close to its current form for thousands of years, and virtually all of it was sold and eaten as an unsliced loaf until shockingly recently. The slicing of bread by machine did not creep in gradually. It has a precise origin point, a single inventor, and a business failure sitting behind it. Understanding why it took so absurdly long to slice a loaf of bread, and then why it happened almost overnight, once it did, reveals more about economics than it does about baking. The mechanical problem was harder than it looks. Bread is not wood or metal. It is soft, slightly elastic, and full of air pockets, which means a blade moving through it tends to compress the crumb before it cuts, producing a squashed, uneven slab instead of a clean slice. Early attempts at bread slicing devices ran into this exact issue. A single blade dragged through a fresh loaf just crushes it. The workable solution turned out to be an assembly of many thin blades moving together, so the loaf was divided all at once, rather than sawed through point by point, with the compression distributed evenly across every slice, instead of concentrated under one moving edge. Think of the difference between trying to push a single finger through a wet sponge versus laying a hand flat across it. One point of pressure deforms the material. Distributed pressure divides it cleanly. That was only half the mechanical puzzle. A machine that could slice a loaf did nothing for the seller if the sliced bread went stale within hours, because cutting into a loaf exposes far more surface area to air than a single crust does. This is the part that stalled the idea. For over a decade, an Iowa-born jeweler named Otto Rohwedder began working on the problem around 1912, convinced that pre-sliced bread would sell if he could actually keep it fresh once it was cut. He spent years developing a machine, only to lose his prototype and blueprints in a factory fire in 1917. He rebuilt the design from scratch. His eventual breakthrough combined the slicing mechanism with an immediate wrapping process, so that the instant a loaf was divided into slices, it was also sealed. The wrapping was not packaging in the modern branding sense. It was the actual solution to staleness, functioning almost like a chemical barrier, holding the bread's moisture in place long enough for it to reach a customer's kitchen, still soft. In 1928, a bakery in Chillicothe, Missouri, agreed to try Rohwedder's rebuilt machine. On July 7th of that year, the first commercially sliced loaves went on sale, marketed with the slogan calling it the biggest advance in baking since bread had first been wrapped at all. Here is where the economics take over. From the engineering, the bakery's sales did not inch upward. Within roughly 2 weeks, sales at that single bakery reportedly rose by around 2,000%. This is the number worth sitting with, because it explains everything that followed. A 2,000% jump in sales from one mechanical adjustment means the demand had been sitting there the entire time, fully formed, waiting for a supplier willing to meet it. Customers were not persuaded into wanting sliced bread through advertising. They had apparently wanted this convenience for a long time, and simply had no access to it. The invention did not create the demand. It unlocked demand that already existed. Word of the results spread through the baking trade almost immediately, and this is where a normal invention story would slow into decades of gradual, uneven adoption. Instead, the opposite happened. Bakeries across the country began installing slicing machines within months, not years. In 1929, Rohwedder was still trying to scale up manufacturing to keep pace with orders from bakeries when the stock market collapsed and the Great Depression began. This timing matters enormously because it explains why adoption accelerated instead of stalling. A convenience upgrade might have been a hard sell to consumers tightening their budgets during a depression, except that sliced bread was not really competing against nothing. It was competing against the labor cost of home slicing and against loaves that went stale faster. Once opened by hand, for a bakery offering pre-sliced bread cost very little extra per loaf. Once the machine was installed, while it dramatically increased how often a household would buy that brand, over a rival's unsliced loaf. In an economy where every business was fighting for a shrinking pool of customer spending, a nearly free differentiator that could increase sales by an order of magnitude was not optional. It was survival. Rohwedder himself was forced to sell the rights to his invention as the Depression squeezed his own company, even as the technology he had created kept expanding into bakery after bakery. The turning point that took sliced bread from a regional novelty to a permanent national fixture came in 1930 when the Continental Baking Company introduced sliced bread under its Wonder Bread label and distributed it nationally. Wonder Bread had the marketing reach and grocery distribution network that a small Missouri or Iowa bakery never could. Once a major national brand adopted the format, every competing bakery selling unsliced bread was suddenly at a structural disadvantage because customers standing in a grocery aisle could choose a loaf that saved them time at home for essentially the same price as one that did not. By 1933, roughly 80% of all bread sold in the United States was pre-sliced. That is a shift from a niche regional experiment to dominating the vast majority of a national market in about 5 years, all inside the worst economic contraction in the country's history. It is worth pausing on how strange that timeline is compared to almost any other major food technology shift. Refrigeration, pasteurization, and industrial canning all took root over spans measured in generations, layered on top of infrastructure that had to be built, regulated, and trusted. Sliced bread required none of that. It needed one machine per bakery and a willingness to change a routine. The barrier to adoption was almost entirely mechanical, rather than cultural or financial, which is precisely why removing that one mechanical barrier triggered such an immediate total shift. This is the pattern behind a huge number of so-called overnight successes in food and consumer goods. The public rarely accepts something because they were convinced to want it. More often, a want was already sitting there, blocked by a single stubborn technical constraint. And the moment that constraint is solved, adoption looks instantaneous because the actual persuasion work had already been done by years of quiet, unmet frustration. The extent of how deeply sliced bread had rooted itself into daily American life became visible in an unlikely way just over a decade later. In January of 1943, in the middle of the Second World War, the federal government banned the sale of sliced bread as part of a broader effort to conserve resources tied to the war effort, including the metal and wax paper used in slicing machines and their wrapping. The backlash was immediate and disproportionate to what looks, on paper, like a minor wartime inconvenience. Households that had spent 15 years without ever needing to slice their own bread suddenly had to relearn a basic domestic task, and many treated the ban with the kind of outrage usually reserved for shortages of essentials like gasoline or sugar. The government reversed the ban within about 2 months. A technology that had existed for barely a generation had already become so embedded in ordinary life that removing it, even temporarily and for a wartime cause, produced a genuine public revolt. That reaction is the clearest evidence available that sliced bread had stopped being a product and had become an assumed baseline of how a household was supposed to function. Step back from bread itself, and this whole episode becomes a case study in a broader pattern of how technology reorganizes human behavior. Before the machine existed, cutting a loaf was simply an invisible, unquestioned part of eating bread, a small task nobody thought to resent, because there was no alternative to compare it against. Once a machine performed that task at industrial scale, the manual version did not just become optional, it became a small daily reminder of inconvenience, something people would actively organize their shopping decisions around avoiding. Human beings tend to accept friction as a natural feature of a task, right up until someone demonstrates that the friction was never necessary in the first place. After that point, the old way rarely survives, no matter how many centuries it had quietly persisted before. A single bread slicing machine did not just change what a loaf looked like on a shelf, it rewired what an entire population considered a reasonable amount of effort to put into their own breakfast. And once that threshold moved, it never moved back.